T. I'm a songwriter. I live in Brighton, and I have been making music since the late 90s, working primarily in the, well, you might call it the indie scene or the punk scene. I've done a little bit of work in the folk scene, although the folk scene tends to hold me a little bit at arm's length, possibly correctly, because a lot of my material is full of swearing and very radical politics and just general rudeness. I have a great life. It's a good thing to be doing. I've been pretty much full-time self-employed as a songwriter and music maker since 2003. God, I'm old. And I've put 10 solo albums out. I've played 2,500 shows around the world. So that's my kind of where I sit. I know very little about history. I do love social history, but my knowledge is probably stretches to the same as someone who regularly listens to In Our Time, rather than you fair people. Late last year, I was approached by CommonAs, who are curators and arts fundraisers based in Lincoln, to ask if I would be the creative lead on this project if it got funding. And over the past, say, 3 or 4 years, as I get older and I want to play fewer shows, and I feel a bit more grown up, I've been trying to say yes to these kind of opportunities. Partly because my audience has started having kids, and where they used to go, we love your music, we play it all the time. Now they go, we love your music, but we can't put your CD on in the house. So it was really useful to me to start thinking in a slightly different way about how I make music and how I engage with the other arts and have a good time as well. So I was definitely excited to be approached, and it's a really fascinating project. A few months ago, when I first came into the Workhouse, basically I had very little knowledge or experience of workhouses generally, or even National Trust properties. I have been to a few when I was a kid with my mum and dad, and waited for the cafe, walked around stately homes, bored. And I came in and I spent 3 really amazing days sort of getting to know people there. And then pretty much as soon as that happened, on the telly, Ian Duncan Smith cried his crocodile tears in the workhouse that I'd just been in a documentary made by Ian Hislop about Victorian poverty. And suddenly it all kind of made sense to me that I was involved in something that I could really get my teeth into. The project is called A Ballad for Southwell. I've been planning to say Southwell, but you've all said Southwell. There is a debate in this small Nottinghamshire town of Southwell of whether you call it Southwell or Southwell, and there's also possibly a class divide on whether you call it Southwell or Southwell. I've got a feeling that if you're like a working person in Southwell, you call it Southwell, and if you're an incomer or slightly better off or working in the arts and heritage sector, you call it Southwell. So I was going to call it Southwell to try and... anyway, it doesn't really matter. We're fairly, as Jim and the team has explained, we're very near the start of this project. I've been going in a kind of capacity of being in residence, so every couple of weeks I will spend 3 or 4 days spending my daytimes at the Workhouse in situ. There are 2 kind of structured bits of that. Mainly, each morning, late morning, I'm still a musician, we'll go and we'll open up a space, and I'll be there doing songwriting workshops and also trying to generate ideas and gather people's thoughts and ideas. Anyone who comes by, anyone who's there, is very welcome to come and join in. So that's included a really broad range of, also the room that we've been using is at the end of the guided tour of the outside of the building. So usefully, lots of people come past as they've just experienced the outside tour. So some of them come in. And even better, Darren from CommonAs is an illustrator and a print specialist, and he's been running these parallel sessions in the same room, giving people the opportunity to do letterpress stuff and make badges and make postcards. And of course that's a great way of just drawing people in with a very simple task where they do something that they have a takeaway from, and then I'm there going, oh well, let's what ideas would you like to contribute if we're going to try and write, and this is the main goal of the project, try and write 15 new ballads of true stories of this workhouse. So that's the goal. I set the number 15. I'm not sure why, but in my head we'll have 15 new songs, of which probably between 9 and 12 of the songs I will end up composing and writing. But it's been made very clear to everyone that if they do want to sort of put in more than just an idea, but put in maybe a whole song, then those are very welcome. As we walk up the path with the birds overhead, the magnificent building lies ahead. The boy, he is scared and holds my hand tight, hiding my own worry for the poor little mite. I hold back the tears and try not to cry as my son leaves my side and I wave him goodbye. The pain is so hard, but I have to stay strong. What else could I do? We have done no wrong. And then she wrote a particularly impressive chorus, if you're thinking in terms of, like, I had my pop music head on, which is like, feelings of fear, feelings of hope, not knowing how to cope. It's not that folky, but it's a great pop chorus. That's Shelley's work, it's not my work. And it's obviously inspired by the long, straight path to the workhouse door, which is particularly impactful at Southwell, because when you first see the building in the distance, you see this enormous, long, straight path. And so quite a few songs that have showed up and ideas that have showed up, and a lot of punters who'd been around the visitors, who'd been around the workhouse, definitely felt that impact of that the moment you're forced into the decision of going, you then have this really physical, very daunting walk to bang on the door and get admitted. One of the worst things someone said was about people taking their children in, that sometimes the children would be quite excited because they'd see this enormous house and they'd be like, Mummy, Mummy, we're going to live here, wow, that's amazing, with no idea of what's coming to them. Another contributor wrote a little chunk of song about the same sort of idea, the first engagement with the workhouse. I sort of do this to the theme of The Last of the Summer Wine, but I hope that doesn't spoil it. From Andrew's eyes the tears fell fast, while longing looks he westward cast. Standing upon the turnpike road, bends beneath his poverty's load. Now here's the chorus. Should he cross the river Greet? Is there a choice? Could he retreat? No, to the workhouse he must go, a God-fearing man to stoop so low. From birth he lived a simple life and shunned his snares of sin and strife. Many hard winters had he braved, used up the little that he'd saved. And then the chorus happens again. I'll do the really sad endy bit. Without a home, without a friend, his life must as a pauper end. But it meant starving to retreat, so broken Andrew crossed the Greet. So to get people who have not written songs before to dive in and have that is fantastic. But there are also challenges with that. So purely thinking about songwriting, I have to think there are too many feelings and not enough story. And if we're going to tell over the course of like 15 songs or a whole set of ballads the actual story, that sort of songwriting is going to be really great and have its place in the project. But partly it will depend on how much the visitors and the people getting involved are happy for me to work with their material and actually change stuff. And partly that both those bits of songwriting, though they were really heartfelt and they are from people who have a great experience and familiarity with the workhouse, are archetypes rather than actual stories. I think that, well, I'd imagined I'd be struggling for ideas, but actually in the outcome the opposite is true. I've been working with the volunteer history researchers, and they're an amazing bunch of mostly elderly people, mostly guys, who have completely embraced the whole internet, finding out about the past. And what they do is they take a piece of evidence of someone who's been at the workhouse, and then they pull it outwards to build a picture of a whole life. And the first time I met them, this guy Derek he slapped down on the desk this A4 envelope, and in it are 14 stories of people who were at some point in the workhouse, and he gave me their whole life stories that he's eked out of newspaper clippings and court reports and genealogy websites and that sort of stuff. And that level of research is just incredibly brilliant. It's going to be like a kind of huge jigsaw process to get all of that material and turn it into a kind of a set of works. We're going to, I'm way out of time, so I'm just going to sort of summarise. We're going to do a couple of live performances. We're going to try and record them in situ, and anyone that wants to get involved with the recording can come. People were going to sing some, hopefully we've got some local musicians who will back us, but also we can keep the backings very sparse, so that it's not going to be a kind of sonically ambitious project in the kind of arrangement sense. However, one of the magic things will be that we can record some of these songs in the rooms where the events they talk about took place. So, for example, there's the crank. The crank is something that the vagrants had to do. If the vagrants weren't admitted long term to the workhouse, they just stayed 1 or 2 nights, and then they worked the day in between to earn their keep. And one of the things they would do is go in this base and turn a crank, and the crank did nothing. They really, really turned a crank. And if you didn't like the vagrant who was turning the crank, you might make it a little bit tighter, so it's harder work. And so we'll be able to, assuming I can write a song about the crank, we'll be able to put that song in the space where the crank used to be. A hugely important part of the project, which really speaks to what these guys have said, and it is the core really, is not to do a load of twee Victorian folk music in costume, but to include as a very integral part of the selection of songs stuff that brings us right up to through the 20th century, through the birth of the welfare state, and into people who were living much more recently in the workhouse. There were people living in the workhouse in the 70s and 80s, and we have the oral history of people's first-hand and second-hand accounts of those lives, which makes it far more vivid and brings it home. And Sam has been working on that. That's one of the things she's been doing, and that some of the resource there is properly astonishing. And one of the characters was a lady who lived 4 years in this tiny sparse flat in the workhouse. Lily, her story is very important to Sam, and in some ways, although I'm going to be writing the song, in the same way that I have to tread carefully about visitors and how they feel about their material, we have to hit the truth. We have to tell the story, and often we don't know that much of substance, but sometimes we know bits. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm really out of time, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm out of time. An angry cat chases us away down the corridor. She's been living up here as long as I recall. Everyone asking, but all anyone knew. A new matron came, and she brought Lily too. A whole of a life in that little room is where my starting point for trying to write a song about Lily. I have a chorus that is, oh Lily, the shadow of a story. And somewhere out of that, as you can hear, it's very early days, will come a song that justifies, a song that honours Lily. The closing bit of the song, she's institutionalised her entire life. So when we meet her, she's an elderly woman in other people's memories, mainly. And so what I do is save up to the final verse, and in the final verse I explain why she was institutionalised in the first place. We know very little about it, but it turns out she had a baby out of wedlock. She wasn't a criminal, she wasn't destitute, we don't know, but she had a baby out of wedlock, and we don't know the details of that either, but the consequence is someone who, in the late 20th century, in some of our lifetimes, was lifelong institutionalised, and that's the bit, like Lily in the Little Room as a song is going to end up, you need that as a backbone. I need that as a backbone for this project, I think. So I haven't got to where I'd like to have got to, but thank you for listening.